Hello and welcome to Press TV's debate. I'm Marzia Hashemi. Well, the Good Friday Agreement brought to an end years of bloodshed between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland. After decades of calm, 23 years later, ironically, on Good Friday of this year, the situation imploded and clashes have taken place. How volatile is this situation, and how much of it is London to be blamed for? Stay with us as we take a look at the latest out of Northern Ireland on this debate. Well, I'd like to start it all off in London with Press TV's very own Amina Taylor. Amina, good to see you as always. So fill us in on this latest situation that is taking place in Northern Ireland.
Marzia, it's almost ironic here that you come to me in London first, because there are many of those historians and political observers alike who will say the issues, regardless of their complexities, are pretty much the result of British interference in the Ireland of Ireland. And now we see for over a week now on consecutive evenings as dusk draws closer that there will be the threat, the ever-looming threat of sporadic and escalating violence breaking out in different parts. Now the last flashpoint was Tiger Bay, Loyalist area where the police came under attack. We're used to perhaps hearing about other communities in Belfast and so on. And we're now dealing with a very important role that Westminster has to play, and where Boris Johnson is with perhaps some of his advisors might be giving him information that's not quite correct, because the idea here that he's resisting calls from Simon Coveney, who is the foreign minister for the Republic of Ireland, to hold a summit on the escalation, because it would be seen as perhaps blowing the issue out of proportion. Well, when scores of police officers have been injured, when dozens of demonstrators have been arrested, and there is the fear that the Good Friday Agreement itself could be undermined, I think it's time for London to act. Now, on Thursday, Westminster sent up Brendan Lewis, who is the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. And as my guest on that occasion said to me, they take with a pinch of salt what representatives from Westminster say, because it's the Northern Ireland Assembly that's supposed to be running its business. And because of the death of the Duke of Edinburgh, there wasn't a statement after that meeting. So we don't know what was agreed to and if that could have some traction. But I think the fact that violence has persisted after those high-level talks between Brendan Lewis and those 5 members of the Northern Ireland Executive gives us some indication, Marzia, that this situation, if not handled deftly, will continue to escalate, and no one wants to see a return to the bad old days, Marzia. No one.
Right, indeed. Thanks so much for that update. Press TV's Amina Taylor out of London. Well, let's cross over now to Belfast. I'd like to welcome Andree Murphy, Irish journalist and political commentator, to the program. Thanks so much for being with us. Your take on the crux of the problem right now that we're seeing this tension in Northern Ireland.
Thanks so much for having me, and I think that Amina summed up very much of it in terms of the broad sweep of issues. If we're going to look at what's happening now, we have to look at England and Wales's vote to Brexit, which was against the democratic wishes of the north of Ireland. The entire population here overwhelmingly voted to remain in the EU, and that changed the political environment here, so that you see that there's demographic changes in terms of the north. So you're seeing more Catholics, nationalists now, nearly fairly much half could after the next census be in the majority, and they traditionally identify as Irish. You see that there is a growing conversation for a new constitutional arrangement on the island of Ireland, so calls for a border poll and calls for Irish unity and what form that may take. You see that Brexit is having a disastrous impact on the Good Friday Agreement, on our peace agreement, and that London really hasn't cared about that. So London pursued its own form of hard Brexit, completely impervious to the standing of the peace agreement and how that would impact this island. And that has left unionism on this island very much isolated. So they've handled Brexit incredibly badly. They supported the vote for Brexit despite the democratic wishes of the people here. They supported a hard Brexit despite it being very clear it was going to have a huge impact on the island of Ireland. And then you saw this large and ever-growing conversation for a united Ireland, and they haven't been able to meet it at all. They don't have a strong argument to stay in the union. So that insecurity has been manipulated and turned into some sort of argument that unionism is being oppressed or left behind, rather than the truth of the matter, which is that unionism needs to engage in these conversations in a more proactive way. And so you have all this false narrative, almost Trumpian narrative, that loyalism is in some way being left behind, that unionism is being left behind, that their culture is under attack, that Catholics, Nationalists and Republicans are doing really well. All of those things aren't true, but still it's taken a currency. And all of that leads to the traditional route where, so to speak, where the British government starts talking to militant paramilitaries in the Loyalist groupings. So the representatives of the British government were talking to them since Christmas. So was the largest party here, the Democratic Unionist Party, as have the police service, talking to militant loyalism, who then start issuing their own statements of concern about their culture and identity and that they won't stand idly by. And then all of a sudden, young, and I mean very young, 13, 14-year-old loyalists start going out on the streets and start engaging in criminal behaviour. Right. And this is kind of traditional, what you sadly have seen in the past, where, and it's called the orange card, that when unionism is under attack or they feel their constitutional position is in some way being compromised, then they will start using these militant tactics.
Okay, but stay with me, Andree. Let me get our next guest in on this conversation. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist out of Bristol. Welcome to the program. Your take, I think you heard what Andree was talking about. How much of what we're seeing right now relates, you think, to Brexit? And if it relates to it, was it basically that the British politicians, it was not important for them? They did not take a look at what a hard Brexit, the effect that it would have for Northern Ireland and Ireland in general?
Well, yes, it's all to do with Brexit, actually. And don't be fooled by my orange sweater here. I'm not an orange man or an orange supporter, which is the Orange Order, which is at the heart of the Loyalist cause in Northern Ireland. And I did live right on the border between County Cavan and Fermanagh for a year or more, and I know the situation there pretty well. Yes, it's all to do with Brexit. And I think what's happened is the British government have just been browbeaten so much by the Irish Republicans in the north, and obviously the south, which is still in the EU and still very pro-EU, plus Brussels, to create this kind of running sore. I mean, they had a choice about having a border. They could have had a border in the Irish Sea, or they could have had a border around Northern Ireland, in between the north and the south. And they chose to have the border in the Irish Sea, which was always going to create problems for the future. Look, the British have, this is the first time they've done this sort of thing. We've seen the same kind of things on the Arabian Peninsula around the time of the First World War, creating the division between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, which is now a running sore. And the same sort of thing in Kashmir between India and Pakistan, are now still a running sore. And, of course, that's exactly what's going on in the north.
Tony,
now.
Are you saying that London wants this division, wants to see these clashes? What are you saying?
Well, I don't think they necessarily want to see it, but they just couldn't be bothered with the issue when it came to the Brexit negotiations. And they really sold out the Northern Irish. And I think that is why the Loyalists are so upset about this. Now, it's not fair to say that they're doing this just for the cameras or whatever. No, absolute nonsense. They've been quiet for a long time, and they've been trying to get something done about this, actually wanting to be part of the United Kingdom. Really, the only thing to solve this now, I think, is to have a referendum right across the north on whether they want to have unification with the south. That would certainly clear things up as to where this border should be. But really, it's the usual fudging from Westminster and head scratching, saying, oh gosh, this is too much of a problem for us over in London to sort out. And of course, that I think and it's a very, very long problem, this. It goes right the way back 350 or so years to the plantation of Ireland by Oliver Cromwell in the mid-1600s, when just after the English Civil War here in England, I suppose what you would call now the UK, because the Scots were involved a bit as well. So back in those days, there was a massive fight over in Ireland at the end of the English Civil War. And the winners were the Cromwellians, and they gave all the land, the good land in the north of Ireland, the good farming land, to the victors in that war. And there were two completely separate cultures. So you've got the Catholic culture generally in the south, and you've got the Protestant culture or Presbyterian culture in the north. Now, these people are not necessarily churchgoers, but they're part of a different culture. And this is what the seeds of the problems that kicked off in 1972 in Bloody Sunday, and the troubles in Northern Ireland, which happened in the latter part of the 20th century. But that was all sorted out, we thought, in 1998 with the Good Friday Agreement. Now, what's happening now, I think, is an attempt to sort of reopen those wounds. But it's something which, in a way, has been left by Boris Johnson and his chums, and particularly Theresa May, this whole backstop agreement thing, from the exiting the Brexit from the EU, that hasn't really been dealt with properly at all. And they need, I think, to have, it's obvious to me, they have to have some sort of border between the north and the south until there's a referendum. When I lived there back in the mid-1990s, there was a massive border. My goodness, if you wanted to get across that border, you had to wait about half an hour at an army checkpoint. I used to cycle across, and it was one of the most strictly policed borders in the whole of Europe. And so what we should have now, I think, is some kind of much lighter touch border with maybe a few spot checks, but there has to be some sort of border. We're talking now about inside and outside the EU, and I don't think it's possible to have a country like Ireland with some part of it in the EU, another part of it out, without a border. And that's the fudge that Boris and Theresa May have left for this present generation. Okay.
Well, Andree, the EU Commission recently closed the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland due to trying to even control vaccines being sent to the UK. This was done briefly, but it was enough to upset some people there in Ireland that if the EU wanted to do it, it could close the border at any time. How do you see this affecting the whole as far as what is going on? And many say just an overall lack of consideration that has come out of London.
I mean, there's no doubt that London doesn't care. None of their negotiations, their thoughts about Brexit, what they wanted to do, gave a second's thought to the north of Ireland. I think if they were asked in the morning, and George Osborne has referred to this, if they were asked in the morning, they would get rid of the north of Ireland if they thought they could get away with it politically. And I think that unionism has recognised that, and there's a real sense of abandonment around that. This year doesn't only mark the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, it's also the 100th anniversary of partition, where an artificial line was drawn on this country, and it's been upheld by violence ever since. And that border has been upheld through murder. It's been upheld through the promotion of violence and the threat of violence. I think that the Good Friday Agreement, when it came along, was a settlement, a constitutional settlement between the two governments and between all of the parties, that everything would be resolved peacefully in the future. And a core part of that was to recognise that the citizens living on the island could, when the conditions were right, make a decision about their constitutional future. So a border poll deciding whether the constitutional arrangement could change is absolutely on the table now as a result of England's decision to leave the EU. And, the British government in particular has been incredibly sniffy and impervious to that general wave of conversation that's happening. They're refusing to countenance calling a date. They're refusing to engage in discussions around planning for such a poll. If there's one thing that we do know from Brexit, is that if there's going to be a poll, it needs to be planned for. people know what they need, must know what they need to be voting for, and especially what will happen to British citizens who live on this island. And right now they are not engaging in that conversation. Unionism and loyalism is watching this conversation happening around them and about them, and not with them. And that is a huge, huge risk for them. And the British government owes them the opportunity to be engaged in constructive conversations about the constitutional future, which will involve relationships with Britain, which will involve British citizens living on this island and their rights. And so far, they're refusing to do it because they don't care. I think what's really important to recognise is that this policy of partition is undoubtedly a colonial policy that they used all through the 20th century, and Britain has yet to come to terms with their obligations as a result of those policies. So one of the factors that is absolutely creating some of the disquiet on the streets is how we deal with the past of our conflict. Right now, the British government is in default of all of its international legal obligations to victims of the conflict, no matter who affected them, whether it was the British state or non-state actors. And they are refusing point blank to put in place any investigations for those victims. Okay. And that's creating huge disquiet. And also, it's preventing the possibility and the potential for improved community relations where we understand our past, where we recognise the hurts and harms that were inflicted on each other, and gives us the opportunity for reconciliation. That the British government is refusing to do that is because they don't want to be embarrassed about their role during the conflict. They don't want the truth about their collusion with loyalist paramilitaries in particular to come out.
Okay.
But what they're doing is they are preventing the opportunity for victims and survivors to have dignity as equal citizens on this island.
Stay with me, Andree.
Inter-community reconciliation.
Stay with me. Tony, your take. I mean, both of you have talked about the importance now of basically having a referendum there. And of course, Andree said that they do not talk about this and what it will take to calm the situation down, because she said that they don't care. Your take on it? I mean, if London, so far they're not talking about having a referendum there, I mean, where do you see this going?
Well, they're going to have to. I mean, they've done it in Scotland, and I think the best way to do referenda like this is to say, well, this is going to be your last chance for the next 20 years to make a decision. In Scotland, they made a decision fairly clearly. They wanted to stay within the Union. And I think they're going to have to do something similar in the north of Ireland as well. But look, there's another side to all of this. Remember, the original uprising against the British Empire, which really was the death knell for the empire, and it was about time too, many would say, I would agree actually, was during the First World War in 1916, the Easter Rising. Easter is a very, very important time in Ireland, not only because there's a lot of people of the Christian faith there, but also because it's the anniversary of the rebellion of the Irish against London back in 1916. And this all kicked off around Easter time a week or so ago. This is, it's an important time of the year, and Irish people all over the island understand the significance of this time of year when they have tried to get sensible policies through the political means, and they've failed. They've been stonewalled, they've been ignored, they've been insulted. It's time to go to the streets, and that's why I think they're doing this. Also, of course, one of the other things which has made things far, far worse, particularly for young people, is all the COVID restrictions that have been around for the last year too. Young people have had enough of all of this. It's like a pressure cooker. They have been told all the time to stay indoors. The police are approaching them, threatening to fine them, prosecute them, even arresting them if they're gathering in the streets and just having a chat with their friends. And I noticed today, the guy's name I think is Mark Hinsey or something. He's the chair of the Police Federation of Northern Ireland for the Northern Ireland Police Force. That is representing, it's kind of like a trade union, representing the rank and file officers, saying that the COVID regulations have made things far, far worse for the police, and also they've broken down trust between the communities and the police. Now, this is a powder keg in Northern Ireland. You cannot do this sort of thing. So the COVID regulations have made things extremely difficult for the police to actually be trusted by the communities. And this is the rank and file police officers themselves saying this. So we need to make sure that that there are better facilities for youngsters. For example, all the youth centres have been closed down, and they're demanding now that they reopen them because the young people need to have something to do.
Stay with me, Tony. I only have a minute. Andree, your perspective. What is it going to take to de-escalate the situation there?
Well, I think that Britain needs to stop pretending that it's neutral and wringing its hands, recognise its obligations, and I think that the idea of a summit that Amina referred to is absolutely essential. All the parties in both governments need to get back around the table, talk about what's outstanding from the Good Friday Agreement and the Stormont House Agreement, and start meeting those obligations. There's legal obligations here, including the holding of the border poll, and that is a significant part of the Good Friday Agreement, and it needs to be planned for.
And on that note, I'd like to thank both of you for being with us. Andree Murphy, Irish journalist and political commentator out of Belfast, and Tony Gosling, investigative journalist out of Bristol. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another debate. I'm Marzieh Hashemi. Hope to see you right here, same place next time. Goodbye.